I thought this temporary, high-paying caregiving job would just keep me from hitting rock bottom after my bitter divorce. But on my very first night in that isolated coastal mansion, I heard a voice so familiar my blood ran cold. The wealthy man. The whole house called insane was the one who warned me I was standing in the middle of a conspiracy. The most horrifying part. My ex-husband did not just know about it, he was part of it. My name is Hazel Lawson. I am 36 years old, and until a few months ago, I believed my life was built on a solid foundation of trust and shared ambition. Then came the end of my marriage. 11 years of history with Dean Kessler evaporated into a bitter, drawn-out divorce that left me entirely broken. Dean did not just walk away from our vows. He orchestrated a calculated financial slaughter. By the time I truly understood that our marriage was over, Dean had already drained our joint savings. He secretly funneled the vast majority of our liquid assets into obscure offshore holding companies and complex trusts. I believed those accounts were safe, a safety net we had built together, only to discover they were empty shells. We never had children. During the divorce proceedings, that fact meant we spared a judge the emotional theater of a custody battle. But what we lacked in dependence, we made up for in suffocating financial liabilities, and I was left holding the bag on every single one of them. I was solely responsible for the exorbitant rent on our downtown apartment, a place that now felt like a sprawling, empty museum of my failures. I was buried under a mountain of legal debt from fighting a losing battle against Dean and his high-powered attorneys. Worst of all, I was saddled with a massive business loan. Dean and I had taken it out to save an online home goods boutique we started together. The moment the profit margins dipped, Dean abandoned the business completely, leaving me to steer a sinking ship straight into a messy, humiliating bankruptcy. I spent my days fielding calls from aggressive creditors and my nights staring at the ceiling, wondering how I had been so blind. But the financial ruin was only half the theft. To force my hand during the settlement negotiations, Dean launched a systematic, ruthless campaign to destroy my credibility. He knew he needed leverage to keep the assets he had hidden, so he painted me to the mediators as emotionally erratic. He told them I was prone to hysterical outbursts and fundamentally incapable of making rational decisions. He twisted normal arguments we had in the privacy of our kitchen into fabricated, exaggerated tales of psychological instability. He lied so smoothly, offering the mediators a look of practiced, sympathetic concern, that I actually began to question my own mind. He gaslit me until I doubted my own memory of our marriage. He ground my self-esteem into fine dust, forcing me to sign a disastrous, one-sided settlement just to make the public humiliation stop. I walked away with next to nothing, stripped of my savings, my business, and my trust in my own sanity. Before the boutique, before Dean convinced me to throw my life into his entrepreneurial dreams, I had a real career. I worked as a senior auditor for Harborline Care Review, a highly respected private medical records auditing firm. My job was not glamorous, but it required a sharp eye and a cynical mind. I dug through thousands of patient files, cross-referenced complex medication logs, and hunted for discrepancies that doctors and nurses tried to hide. I spent years learning the intricate, coded language of pharmaceuticals. I knew how to spot forged physician signatures, how to track missing inventory, and how to identify when a private care facility was over-medicating a patient simply to keep them docile and compliant. I knew how to read the spaces between the lines on a medical chart, finding the stories that the clinical notes tried to bury. That was a past life, though now I was just a broke, discarded woman staring down an eviction notice. I was less than 30 days away from completely defaulting. If I missed the rent for the next 2 months, I would be locked out of my apartment with nowhere to go. I needed cash, and I needed it immediately. That was when I found the listing. I was scrolling through a premium domestic staffing board late at night when the advertisement caught my eye. It stood out like a warning beacon. An ultra-wealthy family was seeking a live-in caregiver for an elderly patriarch. The listing vaguely described the man as suffering from severe mental instability and warned that he was prone to unpredictable, explosive behavioral outbursts. The red flags were everywhere. The compensation package was utterly absurd. It offered a monthly salary that was triple the standard market rate for experienced nursing staff, free room and board on a sprawling private estate, and a massive signing bonus just for walking through the door. The catch was obvious. The listing demanded absolute, ironclad confidentiality. The requirements for a non-disclosure agreement were mentioned in bold text 3 separate times in a very short advertisement. Every single instinct I had honed during my time investigating shady facilities at Harborline Care Review screamed that this was a toxic, highly dangerous situation. But when your bank account balance is hovering near zero, suspicion is a luxury you simply cannot afford. A suspicious job is still infinitely better than absolute desperation. I polished my resume and hit submit. The response was terrifyingly fast. A phone interview was scheduled for the very next morning. The woman on the other end of the line introduced herself as the estate manager. She had a cold, clipped voice and zero interest in small talk. She did not ask a single question about my bedside manner, my empathy, or my philosophy on elder care. Her questions were clinical, rapid fire, and deeply unsettling. She wanted to know my exact tolerance for high-pressure, hostile environments. She asked how I handled physical aggression from grown men. Most importantly, she repeatedly emphasized the need for absolute discretion in the house. She asked me point-blank if I could manage a resistant, potentially violent patient entirely in-house, ensuring that I would never, under any circumstances, involve local law enforcement or call outside medical emergency services. I gave her the answers she wanted to hear. I kept my voice steady, projecting a calm professionalism I absolutely did not feel. Then, the conversation took a sharp, weird turn. The manager paused. I could hear the sound of her rustling through papers over the receiver. She brought up my employment history at Harborline Care Review. She did not ask about my general administrative skills or my work ethic. Instead, she specifically wanted to know exactly how deep my experience went regarding the auditing of controlled substance logs and tracking off-label psychiatric prescriptions. It was an incredibly specific, jarring question for a basic caregiving role. Why would a family hiring a companion care about my ability to audit pharmacy records? Before I could formulate a careful answer, the manager abruptly cleared her throat and changed the subject. Her tone became rushed, as if she realized she had just shown a card she was desperately supposed to keep hidden. That single slip-up made my stomach drop. Something about her sudden pivot felt profoundly dangerous, like I was stepping onto a floorboard that was about to give way. But then I looked across my small kitchen. I looked at the towering stack of past-due bills sitting on my counter. I looked at the finalized divorce decree lying next to them, a crisp, legal reminder that Dean had completely destroyed my life and won. I needed this money to survive. I told myself I only had to endure this bizarre, creepy setup for a few short months, just long enough to bank the exorbitant salary, clear my immediate debts, and get back on my own 2 feet. I accepted the job on the spot, agreeing to their terms without negotiating. I packed my meager belongings into 2 worn suitcases that same afternoon. I truly thought I was making a desperate but calculated move to survive a temporary rough patch. I had absolutely no idea that by taking this job, I was walking right back into the very nightmare Dean had dug for me. The drive up the jagged coastline to Blackwater Cove, Maine, felt like traveling to the very edge of the earth. The sky above was a heavy, bruised purple, threatening a violent storm that never quite seemed to break. When I finally pulled through the towering wrought iron gates, Storm Point House loomed before me like a dark fortress. It was a massive, imposing estate built of rough-hewn stone and sheer expanses of reinforced glass, entirely isolated from the rest of the small harbor town. The ocean wind-up on that sheer cliff was relentless. It battered the exterior of the mansion so aggressively that the heavy leaded window panes rattled incessantly, day and night. The sound echoed down the vast, empty hallways. It sounded exactly like a frantic, desperate person knocking from the outside, begging to be let in, or, as I would soon come to realize, begging to be let out. Walking through the towering double mahogany front doors, I was instantly struck by the suffocating chill of the interior. The house was undeniably beautiful, dripping with the kind of silent, aggressive wealth that made you afraid to touch the sweeping staircases or the antique furniture. But it felt less like a living home and more like a flawlessly decorated, inescapable trap. I was greeted in the cavernous, marble-floored foyer by Greta Sloane. She was the estate manager, a middle-aged woman whose posture was as rigid and unforgiving as a steel rod. Her iron-gray hair was pulled back into a severe knot so tight I imagined it gave her a perpetual headache. Greta did not speak to me. She dictated at me. Every single word that left her thin lips sounded as if she were reciting from a strictly enforced legal compliance manual. When she formally welcomed me to the estate, her mouth curved into a tight, practiced line, but the gesture never once reached her flat, coldly assessing eyes. She handed me a heavy brass ring holding exactly 2 keys and immediately began the mandatory orientation as we walked down a long, dimly lit corridor that smelled faintly of lemon polish and old dust. My patient was Roman Ashford. He was 67 years old and the founding titan behind Ashford Meridian, a massive, globally recognized transportation and infrastructure conglomerate. Greta spoke of his past with a strange, deeply detached reverence, as if she were reading a corporate obituary. She described a man who used to possess a mind like a steel trap, a legendary figure in high-stakes boardrooms, renowned for his flawless memory and his utterly ruthless negotiation tactics. But that man, according to Greta's sterile briefing, no longer existed. Exactly 6 months ago, shortly after the sudden, tragic passing of his beloved wife, Roman had suffered a terrible, physically devastating fall down the grand main staircase. Since that day, his cognitive decline had been rapid, severe, and heartbreaking. Greta told me in a hushed, clinical tone that he had become increasingly paranoid and detached from reality. His temper was described as wildly erratic and deeply combative. The official narrative the house maintained was that he was suffering from profound, irreversible delusions, the absolute most concerning of which was his unshakable belief that his own family members were systematically trying to poison his food and medication. We stopped abruptly outside a heavy, solid oak door located at the very end of the isolated west wing. Greta turned to face me, her expression hardening into something that bordered on a direct threat. She held up 3 fingers and laid out the absolute, unbreakable laws of my employment. Rule number 1. Roman was never, under any circumstances whatsoever, to be given access to a personal telephone, a tablet, or any device connected to the outside world. Rule number 2. I was strictly, legally forbidden from reading, touching, moving, or organizing any of the personal documents or business papers he kept hoarded in his adjacent private study. Rule number 3. The one she emphasized with a sharp jab of her index finger into the cold air between our faces, I was to never, ever deviate from, question, or delay the exact medical protocols and dosages laid out by his private, on-call physician. I nodded silently, my stomach tightening. My past experience immediately cataloged how deeply restrictive, controlling, and highly abnormal these specific conditions were for any standard home care environment. Before we could unlock the door and enter the room, another woman stepped silently out of the deep shadows of the adjoining hallway. This was Marin Ashford, Roman's niece. She was currently acting as the legally appointed temporary coordinator of his vast estate and liquid assets. Marin was visually striking, dressed in a sharply tailored, expensive designer suit that looked entirely absurd for a family member keeping a quiet vigil over a sick relative. She extended a perfectly manicured hand, greeting me with an incredibly smooth, highly articulate cadence. She was polite, engaging, and even welcoming on the surface, but her underlying energy was entirely wrong. She did not radiate the exhausted, tearful anxiety of a niece watching her uncle fade away into dementia. Instead, her dark eyes darted around the hallway, calculating, sharp, and entirely devoid of warmth. She commanded the space with the distinct, cold authority of a corporate crisis manager mitigating a massive public relations disaster. She thanked me profusely for stepping into such a difficult role on such short notice, but her intense gaze felt like a security scanner, actively assessing whether I would be a useful, compliant asset or a potential liability. Finally, Greta produced a key, unlocked the heavy deadbolt, and I stepped alone into Roman Ashford's private quarters. The air inside the sprawling room was stiflingly heavy, thick with the conflicting scents of harsh medical antiseptic and decaying paper. I took a deep breath and braced myself to meet the volatile, deranged, shouting madman they had all just painstakingly described to me. But the figure sitting completely still in the oversized, worn leather armchair by the storm-battered window did not look insane. He looked utterly, bone-deep, depleted. His silver hair was disheveled, and his pale face was etched with deep lines of profound exhaustion. Yet, when he slowly turned his heavy head to look at me, the breath caught painfully in my throat. His eyes were piercing. They were sharp, furious, and highly calculating. They were entirely too alert, too present, and too deeply focused to belong to a man suffering from severe dementia. He was not staring blankly into the void. He was studying me, dissecting my presence in his room with the precision of a cornered predator. I approached him slowly, making sure to keep my hands visible, introducing myself in the calm, measured tone I always used for difficult, unpredictable cases. I offered him a small plastic cup of water so he could take his scheduled midday supplements. Roman did not say a single word to me. He simply reached out a trembling hand and, with a very deliberate, incredibly steady flick of his wrist, knocked the heavy crystal pitcher of water entirely off the side table. It shattered violently, echoing loudly against the polished hardwood floor. Icy water pooled rapidly around the glittering shards of glass. It was clearly not a clumsy, age-related accident or a sudden spastic outburst. It was a clear, defiant, highly calculated test of my reaction. I did not flinch, and I did not scold him. I quietly walked to the adjoining bathroom, grabbed a thick towel, and returned to clean the mess. As I knelt on the wet floor, picking up the jagged pieces, he finally spoke. His voice was a raspy, low, grating gravel that sounded as if he had not used it in days. He began to mutter, the strange words tumbling out in what sounded exactly like a paranoid, fragmented stream of consciousness. He whispered frantically about the digital clocks on the walls, secretly moving backward when no one was looking. He talked rapidly about tiny microscopic hidden cameras buried deep behind the intricate wooden crown molding near the ceiling. Most disturbingly of all, he leaned forward, his face inches from mine, and rasped about the dangerous people who like to sneak silently into the dark house to inject heavy medicine in the dead of night. It sounded exactly like the wild, untethered delusions Greta had just warned me about. It was the absolute textbook rambling of a broken, deteriorating mind desperately trying to make sense of a confusing, frightening reality. But my core instincts, honed from years of reading the terrifying truths hidden between the lines of falsified medical charts, flared violently to life. There was a distinct rhythm to his so-called madness, a strange, terrifying underlying logic to his highly specific fears. I finished wiping the floor, disposed of the broken glass, and stood up to leave the room, giving him the mandated space his chart demanded after a behavioral episode. I reached the heavy oak door and placed my hand firmly on the cold brass knob. Just as I turned the latch, I felt the heavy weight of his gaze burning a hole directly into my back. I stopped and looked slowly over my right shoulder. Roman was standing up now, leaning heavily and painfully against the arm of his leather chair. He was no longer looking at my face or into my eyes. He was staring directly, intently at the small, cheap plastic identification badge pinned awkwardly to my left lapel. He read my name silently, his facial expression shifting rapidly from defensive, wild anger to something that looked terrifyingly like genuine pity. He lowered his voice, dropping the crazy old man act completely and instantly. The words he spoke next were perfectly enunciated, absolutely cold, and utterly, horrifyingly lucid. "Lawson, you arrived too late." The absolute, undeniable clarity in his voice sent a shock of pure, paralyzing ice straight down my spine. The silence of the estate was not peaceful. It was heavy. pressing down on my chest like a physical weight. My first night in the staff quarters was a restless nightmare of tossing, turning, and staring at the unfamiliar shadows stretching across the ceiling. My throat was parched, completely dry from the residual adrenaline of the afternoon. I finally gave up on the illusion of sleep. I slipped out of my narrow bed, wrapping a thin cardigan tightly around my shoulders, and stepped out into the pitch-black corridor. My only intention was to find the main kitchen and pour myself a simple glass of cold water. I navigated the sprawling, labyrinthine house entirely by memory and the faint moonlight bleeding through the towering windows. I stayed close to the wall, trying to muffle the sound of my bare feet against the icy hardwood floor. As I passed the grand staircase, a sudden, sharp noise shattered the quiet. It was a heavy, distinct thud, the unmistakable sound of a solid object hitting the floorboards with force. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. The noise had come directly from the West Wing study. That was the private, heavily guarded sanctuary right next to the patient suite. The estate manager had made the schedule brutally clear during my orientation. Absolutely no one was permitted to step foot in that specific section of the house after 9 o'clock at night. Every instinct honed from my previous career screamed at me to turn around, go back to my room, and lock the door. But the oppressive, suffocating atmosphere of the mansion pushed me forward. If my patient was wandering, if he had fallen and injured himself, it was my legal and professional responsibility to intervene. I crept toward the heavy oak doors of the study, my heart hammering a frantic rhythm against my ribs. The door was slightly ajar, spilling a thin, pale sliver of moonlight into the hallway. I pushed it open just enough to slip my body through the gap. The room was vast, lined from floor to ceiling with dark mahogany bookshelves and smelling intensely of aged leather and stale tobacco. My eyes darted around the gloom until they locked onto a figure standing in the far corner. It was Roman. He was not securely sedated in his bed as the meticulous medical chart had promised. He was standing upright, his body weight leaning heavily against an antique secretary desk. His chest was heaving with exertion, his breathing ragged and wet, but as I stepped closer, the moonlight caught his face. His eyes were not clouded by the fog of severe dementia. They were burning with a fierce, terrifyingly lucid desperation. I opened my mouth to speak, to instinctively call out for the overnight security detail or the estate manager, but before a single sound could escape my lips, Roman lunged forward. His movement was shockingly fast for a man supposedly crippled by cognitive decline. He grabbed my left wrist. His grip was like a vice, his long, bony fingers digging painfully into my skin. He pulled me forcefully into the shadows of the desk, leaning his face so close to mine that I could feel the ragged heat of his breath against my cheek. With his other hand, he shoved a tiny, cold metal object directly into my palm. My fingers instinctively curled around it. It was a small, intricately carved brass key. His eyes locked onto mine, completely dropping the chaotic, rambling persona from the afternoon. His voice was a harsh, urgent whisper, cutting through the dark like a razor blade. Do not let Dr. Hart inject me anymore. And do not let Dean see you here. The air completely vanished from my lungs. The floor beneath my feet felt as though it had violently dropped away. The name hit me with the force of a physical blow to the stomach. Dean. It was impossible. My ex-husband, the man who had just finished systematically destroying every single aspect of my personal and financial life, was supposed to be hundreds of miles away, celebrating his absolute victory in our bitter divorce. There was absolutely zero logical reason for his name to be spoken in this isolated, fortress-like mansion on the rugged coast of Maine. Before my paralyzed brain could even begin to process the sheer horror of that sentence, the heavy silence of the study was violently shattered. Less than 10 seconds after Roman had dropped the key into my hand, the harsh, blinding overhead lights of the adjacent hallway snapped on with a loud electronic click. The sudden illumination poured into the study, exposing us instantly. Heavy, confident footsteps echoed against the marble tiles outside, growing louder, marching with absolute purpose toward the open door. I instinctively ripped my hand away from Roman. shoving the small brass key deep into the pocket of my cardigan just as the heavy oak door was pushed all the way open. Two figures stepped over the threshold. The first was the niece, Marin, dressed impeccably in dark trousers and a silk blouse, looking entirely too alert for the middle of the night. But my eyes immediately bypassed her, locking with a sickening magnetic pull onto the man standing casually by her side. It was Dean. He was wearing a tailored charcoal suit minus the tie, holding a sleek financial tablet in his left hand. Around his neck hung a dark, heavy lanyard holding a premium security access badge. He was not a guest. He was deeply embedded within the intricate, highly restricted system of this estate. When his dark, calculating eyes landed on me standing in the middle of his newest territory, he completely froze. For one single, raw fraction of a second, I saw genuine, unadulterated shock register across his perfectly groomed features. He had not expected to see his discarded, financially ruined ex-wife standing next to the billionaire he was currently circling, but Dean was a master of psychological camouflage. The shock vanished as quickly as it had appeared, replaced seamlessly by the exact same sickening, condescending smirk that used to make my stomach turn during the final, toxic years of our marriage. He adjusted his stance, projecting an aura of absolute control. Marin stepped forward, her sharp eyes darting between Roman, who had instantly slumped back against the desk with a vacant, drooling expression, and me, trembling slightly in the center of the room. She clapped her hands together lightly, the sound echoing like a gunshot. She smoothly introduced Dean to me as the newly appointed asset restructuring advisor. She used sterile, meaningless corporate jargon, explaining that he was brought in to manage the vast estate during her uncle's unfortunate period of severe cognitive decline. She delivered the introduction with a flawless, polite smile, acting as if this horrifying reunion was nothing more than a mildly awkward coincidence between two professionals. Dean did not play along with the polite fiction. He stepped past Marin, his eyes locked onto mine with predatory intensity. He grabbed my upper arm, his fingers digging into my muscle hard enough to leave a bruise, and roughly pulled me out of the study and into the blindingly bright hallway. He backed me into the cold plaster wall, leaning his body in to ensure Marin could not hear his whispered words. He smelled exactly the same expensive cologne and dark roast coffee, a scent that instantly triggered a wave of deep, visceral nausea. His voice was entirely devoid of emotion, a flat, deadened tone that conveyed absolute menace. He told me that I was a desperate woman holding on to a very thin lifeline. He coldly warned me to keep my head down, to do exactly what I was paid to do, and to stay entirely out of matters that did not concern me. He leaned closer, his lips brushing against my ear. He whispered that in a delicate, high-stakes medical environment like this one single false accusation, one hysterical outburst, was more than enough to make a person lose all their professional credibility all over again. The threat was not veiled. It was a direct, brutal reminder of exactly what he had done to me in family court. He released my arm, smoothed the lapel of his expensive jacket, and walked back into the study to join Marin, leaving me trembling violently in the harsh hallway light. I barely survived the rest of that night. I returned to my small, dark room, locked the door, and sat on the edge of the narrow bed, staring blankly at the opposite wall until the pale gray light of dawn began to bleed through the window. My mind was racing, connecting terrifying, impossible dots. The pure, unadulterated shock of seeing Dean manipulating his way through the halls of Storm Point House was overwhelming, but it was not the detail that kept me awake. I reached into my pocket and pulled out the small, heavy brass key, turning it over and over in my sweating palm. The true nightmare, the absolute most horrifying realization of the entire night, was not my ex-husband's presence. It was the undeniable, chilling fact that the old man sitting in the West Wing, the man the entire staff, the niece, and the medical records explicitly labeled as hopelessly, dangerously insane knew exactly who I was. He knew exactly what Dean was doing. Roman Ashford was completely trapped, heavily sedated, and legally isolated, Yet he was the only person in this beautiful, wealthy prison who saw the entire board. And he had just drafted me into his war. The morning sun brought no relief, only the brutal, blinding reality of what I had walked into. I sat on the edge of my narrow mattress, my packed suitcase resting heavily by the door. Every survival instinct I possessed screamed at me to grab my bags, walk out of Storm Point House, and never look back. I had my heavy coat on, my hand hovering nervously over the cold brass doorknob, ready to flee from Dean and the dark, tangled web he was weaving. But then, my phone buzzed in my pocket. It was an automated alert from my bank. The initial direct deposit from the estate had cleared. The amount glowing on the screen was enough to cover 3 months of back rent, stop the aggressive collection calls for the ruined boutique, and put food on my table for half a year. I closed my eyes, the crushing weight of my financial ruin anchoring my feet firmly to the floorboards. Dean knew exactly how trapped I was. He was counting on me breaking under the psychological pressure, expecting me to run away in a hysterical panic just like he had convinced the divorce mediators I would. Dropping my hand from the doorknob, I slowly unpacked my suitcase. I was going to stay, and I was going to swallow my pride. Stepping out of my quarters, the psychological warfare began almost immediately. Dean made sure of it. He did not seek me out in private to threaten me again. His strategy was far more insidious and deeply humiliating. He weaponized every casual encounter we had in the sprawling house. If we crossed paths in the massive kitchen while Greta was preparing morning tea, he would offer a sickeningly sweet smile and loudly ask if I was managing my anxiety well in such a demanding environment. When Marin was within earshot in the grand foyer, he would casually mention how stressful transitions always triggered my emotional instability during our marriage. He expertly framed his cruel sabotage as genuine, lingering concern for a highly fragile ex-wife. He was laying the groundwork, ensuring that if I ever tried to report what I saw, the entire household would already view me as a bitter, mentally unhinged woman obsessed with ruining her former husband. I held my breath for a moment, forcing myself to nod and smile blankly, offering him nothing but cold, empty compliance. My silent endurance allowed me to fade into the background, which gave my analytical mind the space it desperately needed to work. The veteran auditor inside me woke up, sharp and hungry for discrepancies. I began to watch Roman carefully, tracking the exact timeline of his supposedly random dementia flare-ups. I quickly realized they were not random in the slightest. A clear, undeniable pattern emerged from the chaos. The absolute worst of his violent, paranoid outbursts almost exclusively occurred shortly after he was given a specific, thick amber liquid from an unmarked vial, or immediately following the sudden, unannounced wellness checks conducted by his private physician. That physician arrived on my third afternoon, and her grand appearance delivered a shock that nearly knocked the wind out of me. Dr. Lila Hart glided into the West Wing wearing a flawless, sharply tailored white coat over an expensive silk designer dress. She possessed an aura of absolute, intimidating confidence, moving with the slick, practiced grace of someone who was accustomed to being the smartest and most powerful person in any room. The moment her cold, perfectly symmetrical face turned toward me, my lungs completely constricted. I recognized her instantly. She was the woman. The faceless shadow in Dean's deleted text messages. The whispered name on the itemized phone bills I had found during the final, agonizing months of our marriage. Dean had not just left me for another woman. He had left me for the exact doctor who was now controlling Roman Ashford's mind. Lila did not acknowledge our shared, toxic history. She was far too professional and far too dangerous for a petty, dramatic confrontation. Instead, she treated me with a sterile, cutting politeness that was infinitely worse than outright hostility. As she reviewed the daily vitals chart with me, she did not bother to make eye contact. She simply spoke into the air, her voice smooth and deadly. She casually remarked that she sincerely hoped my heavily documented history of nervous tension would not interfere with my ability to follow her complex medical directives. She weaponized the most agonizing chapters of my private life, transforming my personal trauma into a clinical liability right there in the hallway. Every word she spoke was a razor-thin blade, carefully designed to slice away my confidence and remind me that she held all the authority. But Lila and Dean made one critical, catastrophic miscalculation. They assumed my trauma made me stupid. They entirely forgot what I used to do for a living before Dean wrecked my life. That night, while the rest of the house slept, I bypassed the main security desk and accessed the physical medication binder locked inside the secondary nursing station. My fingers flew over the heavy paper pages, my eyes scanning the dense columns of administration logs. It took me less than 15 minutes to find the glaring, systematic discrepancies. The signatures authorizing the heavy sedatives and the amber liquid were a complete mess of contradictory timelines. There were multiple entries indicating that heavy, debilitating doses had been administered to Roman during my exact shift hours, signed off by night staff nurses who were not even scheduled to be in the building. Someone was retroactively altering the official medical records to build a paper trail that justified keeping the old man in a constant, chemical fog. My silent investigation did not stop at the pharmacy binder. I started paying incredibly close attention to the environmental controls of the West Wing. During my mandated breaks, I mentally mapped out the specific security camera placements. I noticed a subtle, recurring anomaly with the tiny red recording light on the dome camera positioned directly outside Roman's private study. I carefully cross-referenced my mental notes with the official incident reports Marin filed daily. The correlation was terrifyingly precise. The camera feed for that specific hallway reliably suffered unexplained signal losses precisely during the exact windows of time when Roman supposedly experienced his most violent, aggressive episodes. The blind spots were not technical glitches. They were deeply intentional. The final, undeniable piece of the puzzle fell perfectly into place late one rainy afternoon. Roman was having a particularly difficult day, pacing the length of his room like a caged animal. His hands were trembling violently, and he was muttering dark, disjointed warnings about the shadows closing in on him from the corners of the ceiling. It was a flawless, terrifying performance of a rapidly deteriorating mind. I sat quietly in the corner chair, holding a fresh towel, simply waiting out the storm exactly as I had been instructed. Suddenly, Roman stopped dead in his tracks. The frantic, manic energy drained from his body in a single instant. He turned slowly to face me, the cloudy confusion evaporating entirely from his eyes, leaving behind a sharp, penetrating clarity. He did not yell. He did not ramble. He looked directly at my face and calmly asked for the exact day of the week, the month, and the current year. I answered him in a low, steady voice, keeping my eyes locked on the closed door. Tuesday, the 14th of November. He closed his eyes tightly and began to mutter again, but this time it was not paranoid nonsense. I leaned forward, straining my ears to hear him over the sound of the rain. He was rapidly calculating complex compound interest rates, mumbling the specific maturity dates of massive corporate bonds, and recalling the exact voting share percentages held by the individual board members of Ashford Meridian. He was actively running a rigorous mental diagnostic on himself. He was fighting fiercely through the thick sludge of the unauthorized narcotics to ensure his cognitive foundation was still intact. He was anchoring his mind to hard, undeniable facts to prevent himself from drowning in the chemical poison they were forcing into his veins. When he finished his rapid calculations, he opened his eyes, gave me a single, infinitesimally small nod of quiet acknowledgement, and immediately resumed his loud, erratic pacing, shouting once again about the walls, listening to his thoughts. I sat back in my chair, the deep chill of the room seeping straight into my bones. The truth was finally laid bare before me, illuminated by the harsh, ugly light of reality. Storm Point House was not a peaceful sanctuary for a dying patriarch. It was an elaborate, heavily funded stage play. I was not hired to be a compassionate caregiver. I was hired to be a credible, easily discredited witness to a carefully orchestrated tragedy. Marin, Dean, and Lila desperately needed Roman to look hopelessly insane, and they needed him to stay exactly that way just long enough for the courts to strip away every last ounce of his legal and financial autonomy. They were stealing an entire corporate empire, and they were using my destroyed reputation as their perfect, disposable cover. The opportunity presented itself on a Thursday afternoon, during a rare 45-minute window of absolute vulnerability in the estate's rigid schedule. Greta Sloan had just signed out for her mandated shift change, her heavy footsteps fading down the eastern corridor as she retired to her private quarters. Marin had left the property entirely, her sleek black sedan crunching over the gravel driveway as she headed into town for what she claimed was an urgent legal consultation. The sprawling house fell into a heavy, suffocating silence, leaving only a skeleton crew of security staff patrolling the exterior grounds. My heart hammered against my ribs, echoing in my ears as I slipped out of my room. I checked the hallway twice before moving swiftly toward the West Wing study. The small, heavy brass key Roman had forced into my hand felt like a burning coal in my pocket. Once inside the shadowy room, I locked the heavy oak door behind me. I moved directly to the antique mahogany secretary desk where Roman had been standing that first night. I ran my fingers along the intricate wood carving, searching blindly until my fingertips grazed a nearly imperceptible seam along the bottom edge of the central panel. There was a tiny, recessed keyhole. I slid the brass key in and turned it. The mechanism clicked with a sharp, metallic snap. A hidden drawer, no wider than my forearm, slid smoothly outward. Inside lay a single object, a worn, crimson leather-bound notebook. I opened it, my eyes racing across the pages. The handwriting was erratic, shifting from strong, commanding strokes to shaky, desperate scrawls, clearly documenting his terrifying battle against the chemical fog they were forcing upon him. But the information itself was razor-sharp. The pages were dense with handwritten legal milestones, the specific names of obscure offshore holding funds, and urgent, circled warnings regarding corporate voting rights. A floorboard creaked behind me. I spun around, clutching the notebook to my chest. Roman stood in the doorway connecting the study to his bedroom. He looked frail, his shoulders slumped, but his eyes were completely clear, fixed on the red book in my hands. I stepped closer, maintaining a cautious distance, and held up the notebook. Roman lowered himself slowly into a leather armchair, leaning forward with his elbows on his knees. The silence between us was heavy, laden with the weight of unspeakable betrayals. He confessed then, his voice dropping to a low, barely audible hum, that he was not entirely lost to his own mind. He experienced terrifying, suffocating periods of profound darkness immediately following Lila Hart's injections. The chemicals effectively severed his connection to reality, leaving him trapped in a terrifying loop of paranoia and physical helplessness. But as the drugs metabolized, there were windows of piercing clarity. Between the forced doses, he understood exactly how his life's work was being actively dismantled. Marin does not care about the standard inheritance, Roman rasped, his gaze fixed on the rain lashing against the window. She has massive, crippling debts from a series of catastrophic private hedge fund failures. She needs liquid capital, and she needs it immediately. Her plan is to use my newly established legal incapacity to bypass the board and execute a rapid, undervalued fire sale of our entire coastal dry port and logistics network. She has a syndicate of friendly, shadow investors lined up to buy the infrastructure for pennies on the dollar. And Dean, I whispered, the name tasting like ash in my mouth. Roman nodded slowly. Your former husband is the architect of the mechanism. Marin had the motive, but Dean provided the method. He built the aggressive forced restructuring model. He is designing the legal framework that makes the fire sale look like a necessary fiduciary rescue to the regulatory boards. In exchange, he collects exorbitant consulting fees through dummy corporations, and he takes a massive, hidden percentage of the final transaction. I looked down at the notebook, the pieces snapping together with terrifying precision. It was never just about greedy relatives fighting over a will. The true battleground was the voting control at Ashford Meridian, and more importantly, a massive community infrastructure trust fund that Roman's late wife had established decades ago. It was a staggering amount of untouchable wealth that Marin and Dean were desperately trying to pry open. Roman looked at me, his expression hardening. He revealed that I was not the first person to stand in this room and realize the truth. There had been at least 2 other caregivers before me. Both of them had possessed sharp minds. Both of them had started asking uncomfortable questions about the contradictory medication logs and the erratic scheduling of Lila Hart's visits. They were gone within 48 hours of asking those questions, Roman stated flatly. Their employment files vanished entirely from the agency systems. I do not know what Dean threatened them with, or how much he paid them to disappear, but they ran, and they left me here to drown. A cold realization washed over me. This was no longer a vague, abstract moral dilemma. This was a countdown to a complete erasure. If I stayed silent, if I simply collected my exorbitant paycheck and looked the other way, Marin and Dean would inevitably win. Roman would be officially declared permanently mentally incapacitated by a corrupt medical review board. He would be legally stripped of his humanity and forcibly transferred to a heavily guarded, closed psychiatric facility out of state, where no one would ever hear him speak a lucid word again. Every fiber of my being wanted to grab the red notebook, march straight to the local authorities, and blow the entire estate wide open. But I forced myself to breathe. I had to remain completely rational. Dean and Lila were apex predators in this specific kind of warfare. They knew exactly how to neutralize a threat. If I acted recklessly, they would instantly twist my actions. They would present me to the police not as a whistleblower, but as a deeply unstable, financially ruined, bitter ex-wife who was obsessively stalking her former husband and actively trying to sabotage his legitimate career. They would use my own painful divorce records, the very documents Dean had meticulously fabricated, to destroy my credibility before I even finished my sentence. I had absolutely zero leverage and absolutely zero margin for error. "We cannot fight them in the open," I whispered, closing the notebook and sliding it back into the hidden drawer. "Not yet. If Dean even suspects that I'm looking at the financial structures, he will have me removed from the property today. We need absolute, irrefutable proof of the medical tampering first. We have to build a case they cannot spin." Roman understood completely. Sitting in the dimly lit study, surrounded by the silence of the massive house, we forged a desperate, secret alliance. We established a strict, unbreakable set of rules for our survival. Beyond the heavy oak doors of the West Wing, nothing could change. In front of Greta, Marin, Lila, and especially Dean, we had to maintain the exact dynamic they expected. We had to remain emotionally distant and strictly professional. Roman had to continue delivering his carefully calculated performances of madness. He had to throw his food, shout at the shadows, and act like a broken, hollow shell of a man. But behind closed doors, in the stolen, quiet moments between shift changes and medication rounds, we would meticulously piece together the shattered fragments of the truth. I turned the brass key, locking the hidden drawer, and handed it back to him. Our pact was sealed, bound by mutual desperation and a shared, profound hatred for the man who was destroying us both. I turned to walk back into the hallway, preparing to resume my role as the compliant, broken employee. Just as I placed my hand on the doorknob, Roman spoke one final time. His voice was softer now, completely stripped of any anger, leaving only a dark, chilling certainty that made the blood freeze in my veins. "You need to understand the true scope of the danger you are in, Hazel," he said softly. "If they win this, I am not the only one who loses everything. You will be dragged straight down into the dirt right alongside me. Dean did not just steal your money during your divorce. I saw the early restructuring drafts before they started heavily drugging me. He used your name somewhere in the foundation of this fraud, and you do not even know it yet." I began my hunt not with dramatic confrontations, but with the quiet, methodical precision of an auditor. I turned my personal phone on silent, disabled the flash, and started treating the West Wing like a crime scene. Whenever the massive house fell quiet, I slipped into the secondary nursing station and secretly photographed the intricate, coded labels on the discarded medication vials Lila Hart left behind. I spent my midnight break sitting on the floor of my closet, cross-referencing those high-resolution images with the official daily care logs kept on the main desk. My old instincts took over, calculating batch numbers, matching dispensing times, and scrutinizing the illegible scrawls of authorized signatures. The discrepancy I found was glaring and terrifying. A heavy, highly restrictive chemical sedative, a drug strictly designed to suppress severe, institutionalized psychotic episodes, was being systematically logged into the official binder under the name of a mild, over-the-counter anti-anxiety medication. They were paralyzing his nervous system and legally recording it as routine stress management. I started keeping my own private comparison chart, written in a tiny, coded shorthand on a piece of paper I kept folded inside my shoe. I paid close attention to the daily behavioral incident reports Marin submitted to the estate lawyers. The language she used was a masterclass in legal manipulation. When Roman simply refused to eat a meal because he suspected it was laced with sedatives, the official report translated his action into a severe refusal of life-sustaining nourishment due to advanced delusional paranoia. When he knocked a plastic cup off a table in frustration, it was documented as a violent, unprovoked physical escalation requiring immediate chemical restraint. They were not merely writing medical notes. They were carefully drafting a bulletproof legal petition for an emergency guardianship extension, using the exact statutory buzzwords a judge would look for. I needed to know how deep the complicity ran among the staff, so I decided to gently test the waters. I found Greta Sloan methodically polishing the silver in the silent dining room. Keeping my voice completely casual, I asked her why a specific night injection had been signed off in the logbook 2 hours before the medication lockbox was actually opened. Greta did not look up. Her hands completely stopped moving. She stood frozen for a long, agonizing moment, the silver spoon gleaming in her rigid grip. When she finally turned her cold, dead eyes toward me, her face was a mask of pure ice. She told me, her voice devoid of any human warmth, that in this house, people who stayed too curious for too long rarely stayed employed at all. It was not a defense of her own actions. It was a quiet, terrified acknowledgement of a machine she was entirely too afraid to fight. The absolute last thing I expected was help from the inside. Elias Brome, the head of estate security, was a giant, silent man who moved through the halls like a shadow, seemingly doing nothing but enforcing Marin's draconian rules with blind loyalty. But 2 days after my tense exchange with Greta, I walked into my quarters and found a small, unmarked data drive resting deliberately on the center of my freshly made bed. I plugged it into my phone using an adapter I kept hidden in my travel bag. It contained a single, unedited video file copied directly from the West Wing corridor cameras, time-stamped from 2 nights prior. The official incident report for that specific evening claimed Roman had lunged violently at the medical staff without any warning, requiring an emergency subduing dose. The raw, uncut footage showed the exact opposite. Roman was standing calmly near his door when Lila Hart approached him from behind, a prepared syringe already uncapped in her hand. She deliberately grabbed his arm, pressing the needle against his skin before he even knew she was there. His violent physical reaction was not a psychotic break. It was a desperate, primal act of self-defense against a sudden chemical assault. Elias knew exactly what they were doing to the old man, and he was silently handing me the ammunition to stop them. I needed more historical context to build a solid timeline, so I took a massive risk. Using a prepaid burner phone I bought during my one authorized trip to the local pharmacy, I tracked down Cora Dempsey. She was one of the former caregivers Roman had mentioned, the women who had vanished from the agency system. When she finally answered the phone, her voice was trembling with residual fear. I gained her trust by mentioning the hidden drawer in the study, proving Roman had spoken to me. Cora broke down crying. She admitted she had officially reported to management that Roman was experiencing long, highly coherent periods of profound lucidity. The very next morning, Marin's corporate attorneys threatened Cora with a massive, life-ruining civil lawsuit for supposedly violating her non-disclosure agreement by discussing a patient's condition inappropriately. But Cora gave me the final, missing piece of the puzzle. She told me Dean Kessler had been physically present in the mansion during the very first month Roman's condition allegedly began to deteriorate. Dean was not a recent addition brought in to manage an existing crisis. He had been there from the absolute beginning, acting as a specialized consultant tasked with identifying non-core assets for immediate liquidation. He had helped build the cage before Roman even realized he was trapped. Armed with this timeline, I mentally reviewed the dense notes I had memorized from Roman's red notebook. There was a specific, heavily underlined reference to a secret legal addendum attached to his late wife's original estate documents. The clause was brilliant. If concrete, undeniable evidence of elder exploitation for financial gain was presented to the board, Roman's voting rights did not automatically default to his next of kin. Instead, a fail-safe mechanism would trigger, temporarily transferring all corporate voting control to a completely independent ethical trust, managed solely by his late wife's fiercely loyal former attorney. I sat in the dark of my room, staring at the glowing screen of my burner phone. The realization hit me with absolute clarity. Proving that Roman was sane was no longer enough. If I simply proved he was lucid, Dean and Lila would just pivot their strategy, claiming a miraculous temporary recovery while they aggressively accelerated the asset sale before the courts could catch up. To completely flip the board and save us both, I did not just need to prove Roman's cognitive health, I had to systematically dismantle their entire operation. I had to gather enough airtight, irrefutable documentary evidence to expose a highly coordinated, multi-million-dollar medical and financial racketeering scheme. I was no longer just a disgraced wife trying to survive a humiliating job. I was actively hunting the people who had tried to bury me, and I was going to use their own paperwork to dig their graves. I knew better than to play doctor. Simply throwing the amber vials down the drain or swapping pills would be a reckless, amateur move. Lila Hart kept meticulous, albeit falsified, inventory. If she noticed the chemical levels dropping without authorization, she would instantly tighten her grip, and I would be fired before the sun went down. I needed a documented external medical trail, one that bypassed her entirely. Using the prepaid burner phone, I took highly magnified photographs of the drug labels and the corresponding administration sheets. I encrypted the files and sent them to a former clinical pharmacist I trusted from my days at the auditing firm. I typed a brief message detailing the exact dosages and Roman's physical symptoms. It took exactly 2 hours for the reply to arrive. My contact confirmed my worst fears. The specific combination of the heavy, off-label tranquilizers and his standard daily supplements was designed to artificially suppress his central nervous system, creating severe medically induced hypotension. I used that exact chemical vulnerability to lay my trap. On a late Friday evening, when Marin was hosting a private dinner in the East Wing and Lila was officially off duty for the weekend, I carefully altered Roman's routine. With his quiet consent, we skipped his evening hydration and kept the room temperature deliberately warm. When his blood pressure naturally dipped to a sluggish 90/60, I slammed my hand against the emergency call button, but I did not page Lila. I bypassed the internal protocol and directly contacted the county's after-hours emergency medical service, reporting an acute, unexplained cardiovascular event. A young, exhausted on-call physician arrived within 30 minutes. He had absolutely no connection to Marin or the estate's payroll. Operating strictly on standard emergency protocols, he immediately ordered a comprehensive metabolic panel and a stat blood toxicology screen to determine the cause of the sudden drop. I stood quietly in the corner, playing the role of the panicked, helpless caregiver while he drew the vials of blood. When the preliminary lab results were securely transmitted to the main desk the following morning, I intercepted the facts. The numbers were not enough to definitively prove criminal intent in a court of law yet, but they clearly established that Roman was flooded with synthetic sedatives that vastly exceeded any legitimate therapeutic need. We finally had an independent baseline. While I gathered the paper trail, Roman executed his part of the strategy with flawless precision. He understood that our enemies needed to feel completely invincible. The next morning, Marin stepped into the West Wing to observe his breakfast routine. Roman did not just act confused. He orchestrated a masterpiece of deterioration. He looked directly at his niece, his eyes wide and vacant, and asked why a strange woman was standing in his bedroom. Then, with a sudden, violent sweep of his arm, he sent the entire silver breakfast tray crashing to the hardwood floor, porcelain shattered, and hot coffee soaked into the expensive Persian rug. Marin did not flinch. She simply offered a tragic, deeply satisfied sigh, completely convinced that her uncle's mind was finally dissolving into permanent darkness. She walked away, believing her timeline was perfectly on track. But as Marin grew confident, Dean grew restless and increasingly aggressive. He cornered me in the industrial kitchen later that afternoon while I was preparing a fresh pot of tea. The casual, mock-sympathetic act he usually performed for the staff was gone. He leaned against the stainless steel counter, invading my personal space, his eyes cold and dead. He brought up our bankrupt boutique, smoothly referencing the mountains of legal paperwork we had processed during the liquidation. He lowered his voice to a menacing whisper, casually noting that I always had a terrible habit of signing documents without reading the fine print. He smiled, a thin, cruel line across his face. He told me that putting your signature on a digital line is an incredibly dangerous habit when you place your trust in the wrong person. The threat was so specific, it made my blood run cold. I retreated to my quarters, locked the door, and immediately opened my laptop. I dug frantically through the archived digital folders from my divorce settlement. A sickening realization washed over me. During the final months of our failing business, Dean had managed all the vendor contracts. I had granted him administrative access to my verified, legally binding electronic signature file to expedite the bankruptcy filings. He never deleted it. He still held the master cryptographic key to my identity. He could forge my consent on virtually any document in the world. That night, armed with a terrifying new understanding of my own vulnerability, I crept into the main administrative office. The room was dark, illuminated only by the faint green glow of the massive, commercial-grade network printer Marin used for her daily legal briefings. I knew from my auditing days that these advanced machines maintained a temporary, hidden cache of every document processed through their hard drives. I accessed the diagnostic menu and forced the printer to spit out the last 50 pages of its internal memory logs. I sat on the floor, using a small penlight to scan the freshly printed sheets. Buried beneath layers of mundane estate maintenance receipts, I found the smoking gun. It was an authorized wire transfer invoice for consulting services rendered. The payment was staggering, amounting to $250,000, pulled directly from Roman's primary living trust. The recipient was a corporate entity named North Key Stabilization. I recognized the structural blueprint instantly. It was a classic, impenetrable shell company, shielded by a nested series of anonymous limited liability corporations. It was the exact same financial architecture Dean had used to hide our marital assets. Dean was not just collecting a standard advisor's salary. He was systematically draining Roman's wealth through a phantom company before the official asset sale even began. But the financial theft was not the most horrifying thing I pulled from the printer cache. 10 pages deeper into the stack, I found a drafted legal motion addressed to the State Guardianship Board. My eyes scanned the dense paragraphs, my breath catching in my throat. It was a preemptive character assassination, a meticulously written narrative designed to completely destroy me if I ever tried to blow the whistle. The document officially characterized me as a deeply unstable employee exhibiting highly abnormal, inappropriate psychological attachment to the patient. It falsely claimed I was projecting my own well-documented, unresolved marital trauma onto Roman's medical care, accusing me of actively interfering with his treatment out of a twisted, hysterical savior complex. The absolute horrifying truth finally crystallized in my mind. Dean did not just casually stumble upon me working at this estate. He had specifically engineered my hiring. Marin needed an easily discredited witness to ensure the medical tampering remained hidden. Dean offered them the perfect scapegoat, a financially ruined, emotionally exhausted ex-wife with a legally documented history of supposed mental instability. If anyone ever discovered that the billionaire was being chemically poisoned, Dean would simply activate the trap. He would use my stolen electronic signature to fabricate false medical logs, framing me as a rogue, obsessed caregiver who overdosed the old man. Dean had brought me to Stormpoint House for one specific reason. I was meant to be the human shield for their syndicate, carefully positioned to take the absolute hardest fall when the empire finally collapsed. The small, windowless security office at the edge of the estate grounds became our makeshift war room. Operating entirely off the grid, Elias Brome, Cora Dempsey, and I began fusing the isolated fragments of our individual discoveries into a single, terrifying mosaic. Through encrypted calls on Elias's secure channels, Cora provided the historical timeline of the staff turnover, while Elias pulled the digital access logs that Marin thought she had permanently erased. With my background in complex auditing, I anchored the data, drawing the invisible lines connecting the medical malpractice to the corporate sabotage. We quickly realized we were not looking at a simple, opportunistic cash grab by a greedy relative. We were staring at a highly sophisticated, multi-million-dollar financial model. Dean had built a systematic engine specifically designed to exploit cognitive decline, legally paralyzing a billionaire so they could force the sale of strategic corporate assets vastly below their true market value. The deeper we dug into Marin's background, the faster her polished veneer of the concerned niece disintegrated. Elias managed to access a shadow credit report that the estate's primary lawyers had conveniently ignored. Marin was not simply stepping in to manage the family legacy. She was drowning in a spectacular ocean of personal debt. A private hedge fund she had launched 3 years ago had catastrophically failed, leaving her personally liable for tens of millions of dollars in margin calls to some very unforgiving private creditors. She was days away from total financial ruin. The rushed, heavily discounted sale of Roman's massive coastal logistics network was not a fiduciary strategy. It was her final, desperate lifeline. She was going to sell a billion-dollar infrastructure empire for pennies on the dollar to a syndicate of friendly shadow investors, taking a massive kickback to clear her own ledgers. But Marin was only one head of the Hydra. The most sickening revelation emerged when I cross-referenced the North Key stabilization accounting files I had pulled from the printer cache with Lila Hart's private medical practice records. Lila was not just Dean's new partner, brought in to rubber-stamp the chemical restraints. She was on the payroll. I found a recurring digital wire transfer routing from a subsidiary of North Key directly into a limited liability corporation registered to Lila's maiden name. She was receiving astronomical, off-the-books medical advisory fees from the exact same shell company that Dean controlled. It was a massive, illegal conflict of interest. Every single heavy sedative she prescribed, every terrifying diagnosis she added to Roman's chart, was directly tied to a massive financial payout. She was poisoning a man for profit, hiding behind a pristine white coat. Then, the investigation struck a nerve so deep, so profoundly personal, that it momentarily stopped the air in my lungs. While tracing the convoluted routing numbers associated with North Key, I recognized a very specific, obscure offshore intermediary bank. It was the exact same financial institution Dean had used to stonewall the discovery phase during our divorce. I rushed back to my quarters, pulling up the bitter, finalized settlement documents I kept hidden at the bottom of my suitcase. The account structures matched flawlessly. During the final months of our marriage, Dean had used a shadow subsidiary of North Key to quietly siphon our joint liquid assets out of the country, artificially depressing his net worth to drastically lower his financial obligations to me. The gravity of this discovery completely shifted the axis of the war. Dean had not just stolen my money, he had used the exact same architecture to rob me that he was currently using to bleed Roman Ashford dry. If I could definitively prove the illegal money trail flowing out of Stormpoint House, I would not just save the old man, I would simultaneously blow Dean's impenetrable financial shield to pieces. It would give me the exact legal ammunition I needed to completely reopen my own finalized divorce settlement and take back every single thing he had stolen from me. It was a devastating counterstrike Dean could not possibly anticipate. precisely because he believed he had already crushed my spirit beyond repair. I needed to know how to detonate the evidence, so during my next isolated shift in the West Wing, I quietly asked Roman about the legal addendum in the red notebook. I asked him why the ethical trust had never been activated if his late wife's attorney was so fiercely loyal. Roman let out a harsh, bitter laugh, his clear eyes hardening. He told me that Arthur Bell, his brilliant, ruthless longtime lawyer, had not vanished or abandoned him. Marin and Dean had simply weaponized the legal system against him. In the early days of Roman's supposed decline, Marin had forced him to sign a heavily doctored power of attorney directive, claiming Roman felt intensely paranoid and physically threatened by Arthur's presence. They legally barred the lawyer from stepping foot on the estate grounds or initiating any direct contact with his former client. Arthur was locked out, forced to watch the empire burn from the other side of the gates. Using a secure burner phone provided by Elias, I finally made contact with Arthur Bell late on a Tuesday night. The moment I mentioned the red notebook and the hidden drawer, the old lawyer's professional detachment vanished, replaced by a sharp, aggressive urgency. Arthur confirmed that the ethical trust addendum was absolutely still valid and possessed the power to freeze all of Marin's executive actions instantly, but the legal threshold to trigger it was incredibly high. To bypass the corrupt guardianship order Marin had already established, Arthur needed ironclad, incontrovertible proof of the systematic exploitation. More importantly, he warned me that the evidence had to be filed simultaneously with the corporate board of Ashford Meridian and the state guardianship court. If Dean and Marin caught wind of the filing even 1 hour before it was officially docketed, they would use their emergency powers to have Roman legally declared incompetent that very same day, permanently nullifying his rights and rendering the ethical trust void. The stakes were higher than they had ever been. I spent the next 48 hours compiling every photograph, every altered medication log, every financial routing number, and the raw security footage Elias had provided. I was sitting on the floor of my room well past midnight, meticulously organizing the explosive documents into 3 separate, heavily secured physical dossiers. I was so deeply focused on the paper trail that I did not hear the soft click of my door unlocking. I snapped my head up just as the door swung open. Greta Sloane stood in the threshold. The breath completely left my body. I froze, my hands hovering over the damning evidence spread out across the hardwood floor. Greta's cold. Assessing eyes immediately dropped to the intricate charts detailing her employer's multi-million-dollar fraud and the undeniable medical logs of Lila Hart's illegal chemical sedatives. I braced for the inevitable sound of the alarm, fully expecting her to summon Dean and Marin, effectively ending my investigation and sealing my fate in a single, brutal second. She stepped inside and softly closed the heavy wooden door behind her. The silence in the small room was deafening. Greta did not yell. She simply stared down at me, her face completely devoid of its usual rigid, compliant mask. She looked older, heavier, carrying a burden that seemed entirely separate from her strict domestic duties. She pointed directly at the files and spoke, her voice dropping to a harsh, barely audible whisper. "You have exactly 2 choices right now. You can gather your belongings and leave this house immediately, or you can stay and prepare to be entirely crushed by them." I did not move. I did not attempt to hide the papers or formulate a panicked excuse. I simply looked up at her, waiting for the killing blow. But instead of pulling a radio or turning her back on me to report my actions, Greta slowly reached into the deep pocket of her tailored gray uniform. She pulled out a thick, unmarked manila envelope and deliberately dropped it directly onto the center of my meticulously arranged files. My eyes widened as I looked down at it. It was the original, handwritten medical logs from the secondary nursing station, the very ones Lila Hart believed she had permanently destroyed when she retroactively created her pristine, legally binding digital versions. The physical evidence of the drug tampering, written directly in the doctor's own hand, was sitting right there. Greta looked down at the envelope, then slowly met my gaze. She told me, her voice breaking just slightly for the very first time since I had met her, that she had served the Ashford family faithfully for 22 consecutive years. She had watched the late Mrs. Ashford build the community trust from the ground up, fighting fiercely to protect the vulnerable. Greta had remained silent for months, watching the life drain from a good man out of sheer, paralyzing fear of her own destruction. But she looked at the mountain of evidence I had painstakingly gathered, then looked me dead in the eye, and told me she simply refused to sit back any longer and watch Storm Point House become the final resting place of a legally sanctioned, ruthless robbery. The strike came before dawn. The storm that had been threatening the coast finally broke, battering the stone walls of the estate with a terrifying fury. I was exactly 12 hours away from finalizing the files and handing the compiled dossiers over to the state authorities. But Dean did not build his lucrative, destructive career by being slow or careless. He had installed a silent, highly sophisticated digital tripwire deep within the administrative network, a hidden security protocol that immediately flagged my unauthorized retrieval of the printer cache. At exactly 6 a.m, the heavy wooden door to my staff quarters was violently kicked open, the brass lock shattering inward. Dean stood in the doorway, flanked by two towering, broad-shouldered private security contractors I had never seen before on the property. He did not wear his usual smug, condescending mask this time. His face was a portrait of cold, calculated fury. In his hands, he held a freshly printed legal injunction. His voice boomed over the sound of the rain lashing against the window. He loudly, aggressively accused me of committing severe corporate espionage, of stealing highly confidential personal health records, and of psychologically manipulating a vulnerable, dying elderly patient to enact a twisted, personal vendetta against my former husband. He gave me exactly 10 minutes to pack my belongings. I was explicitly forbidden from speaking to any member of the staff. The two guards flanked me, watching my every move as I threw my clothes into my suitcase. I was physically escorted off the property, shoved out the massive front doors, and into the freezing, torrential downpour, while Dean watched silently from the dry, elevated sanctuary of the stone porch. Before the heavy iron gates even locked behind my car, Marin had already launched her devastating counteroffensive. I sat in my freezing vehicle on the side of the winding coastal highway, my clothes soaked straight through to my skin, listening to an urgent, scrambled voicemail from Elias. He warned me that Marin was actively using my alleged sabotage and my supposed mental instability as the ultimate, undeniable proof that her uncle's environment was dangerously compromised. She was demanding the judge sign an immediate emergency transfer order to relocate him to a highly restrictive, closed-door psychiatric facility located 3 states away. If they successfully moved him across state lines before the morning, the local jurisdiction would completely vanish. Every remaining shred of his sanity, and any hope of saving him, would be permanently buried under a massive mountain of impenetrable, out-of-state institutional bureaucracy. Dean was absolutely certain he had won the war. He calculated that a woman with 0 stable income, a permanently ruined professional reputation, and a legally documented history of emotional volatility would simply shatter into pieces when pushed out into the freezing cold. He expected me to drive away in a blind panic, terrified of the massive, life-destroying retaliatory lawsuits he had just threatened me with in the hallway. He truly thought I was completely broken. But he fundamentally underestimated the profound, blinding clarity that comes from having absolutely nothing left to lose. I drove straight to a cheap, decaying roadside motel on the industrial outskirts of town, paying for 2 nights in advance with the last of my cash. I locked the flimsy door, closed the stained curtains, and turned the small, damp room into my final command center. Just as I opened my laptop on the scratched wooden desk, my prepaid burner phone rang. It was Arthur Bell. The brilliant, fiercely loyal lawyer was no longer operating carefully from the shadows. He had officially stepped into the glaring light, filing a public notice of appearance with the state court. Arthur confirmed that his former client had not just left a passive ethical trust waiting to be activated. Knowing Marin's ruthless nature, Roman had drafted a highly specific, aggressive contingency directive years ago. It explicitly stated that if his primary legal counsel was ever forcibly barred from communicating with him by a medical guardian, a secondary, automated forensic audit of his entire estate was legally required to commence immediately. We just needed the explosive trigger to blow the doors off Marin's ironclad guardianship. That exact trigger arrived precisely 3 hours later. Elias Brome had taken one final massive risk before my sudden eviction from the house. He bypassed the estate's heavily monitored primary servers entirely and accessed the raw physical hard drives located in a dusty, forgotten secondary maintenance room. He sent me an encrypted video file. It was not security footage of Roman pacing in his room. It was raw, unedited footage of Dean and Lila Hart. They were standing closely together in a narrow supply closet they clearly thought was unmonitored, whispering fiercely about the upcoming court-mandated competency evaluation. Lila explicitly complained about the extreme difficulty of maintaining the exact, delicate chemical balance required to keep the patient docile. Dean's voice was crystal clear on the audio track. He coldly instructed her to forcefully adjust the patient's presentation, explicitly ordering her to increase the synthetic sedatives by 30% for the next 48 hours. He stated, without a single shred of hesitation, that they needed the old man completely medicated and physically unable to form a coherent sentence when the state evaluator walked into the room the next day. Exactly 10 minutes after I watched Dean orchestrate the chemical assault on tape, my secure email inbox chimed. It was Cora Dempsey. She had spent the entire morning frantically digging through her old, archived personal servers. She forwarded me a pristine, digitally time-stamped chain of correspondence from her time working at the estate. It was her original, highly detailed incident report, explicitly warning Marin about the terrifying, unnatural side effects of the off-label medications. Directly below it was Marin's ruthless, demanding reply. The niece explicitly ordered Cora to delete the professional medical terminology and rewrite the entire incident report to sound exactly like a naturally occurring, unprovoked paranoid delusion. The documentary chain of premeditated, coordinated fraud was now absolute and undeniable. I spent the next 9 hours turning the small motel desk into a relentless assembly line. I printed, highlighted, cross-referenced, and bound every single piece of evidence. I created 3 massive, identical, heavily secured physical dossiers. The first one was addressed directly to Arthur Bell, giving him the exact legal ammunition he needed to completely destroy the corrupt guardianship order in front of the judge. The second packet was scheduled for overnight delivery directly to the lead independent ethics investigator sitting on the corporate board of Ashford Meridian, providing undeniable proof that the impending logistics sale was a catastrophic, illegal fire sale orchestrated by a compromised proxy. The third and final binder was sent straight to the highest-ranking state inspector general for vulnerable elder abuse, intentionally bypassing the local law enforcement authorities Dean had likely already neutralized. I sealed the final manila envelope just as the sun began to set over the dark ocean. My hands were shaking violently, my eyes burning from pure exhaustion, but the trap was finally set. Tomorrow morning, the emergency hearing to finalize the massive asset sale and the forced facility transfer was scheduled to begin. But right as I stood up to grab my car keys and drive to the overnight shipping center, my burner phone vibrated violently against the cheap wooden desk. I answered it immediately, expecting to hear Arthur's voice. Instead, it was Elias, calling from a deeply scrambled, untraceable line. His voice was breathless, panicked, and barely a whisper. He told me I had to brace myself for the worst possible outcome. Less than 1 hour ago, under the heavy, intimidating supervision of Dean and Lila, Roman had officially signed a brand new, legally binding document. Elias did not know what was printed on the paper, only that Marin had immediately locked it inside her briefcase with a look of absolute triumph. The line went dead, leaving me standing entirely alone in the suffocating silence of the motel room. A freezing wave of pure terror washed over me, threatening to pull me under. I had absolutely no way of knowing the truth. I did not know if the heavy narcotics had finally broken his brilliant mind completely, forcing him to surrender his massive empire and sign his own death warrant, or if the ruthless corporate titan had just played his final, desperate card to keep me in the game. The great room of Storm Point House had been entirely transformed into a high-stakes corporate tribunal. The massive mahogany dining table was cleared of its usual ornate centerpieces, dominated instead by a glowing wall of secure video monitors connecting the room directly to the Ashford Meridian Board of Directors. Marin had rushed this emergency hearing because the buyer for the logistics network demanded an executed contract by noon. She could not afford a single hour of delay. Marin walked into the room looking like a queen about to be officially crowned. She wore a sharp, immaculate designer suit, exuding an aura of absolute, untouchable victory. Lila Hart sat confidently beside her, perfectly composed, a thick binder of heavily sanitized, fabricated medical records resting squarely under her manicured hands. Dean stood near the massive stone fireplace, projecting absolute arrogance. He genuinely believed that because he had thrown me out into the freezing rain yesterday morning, I was completely eliminated from the equation. He thought a financially ruined woman would simply vanish into the shadows. Then the heavy double doors opened, and I walked in. I was not alone. Arthur Bell, radiating the terrifying, commanding authority of a legal titan who had just been unchained, walked firmly by my side. Dean's smug, condescending smile instantly cracked, replaced by a flash of genuine panic. He stepped forward, opening his mouth to demand my removal, but before a single word could escape his throat, a private nurse wheeled Roman into the room. My heart plummeted straight into my stomach. Roman was slumped heavily in the chair, his eyes vacant and glassy, his chin resting weakly on his chest. He looked entirely broken, locked in a terrifying, impenetrable silence. For a horrifying, breathless second, I thought the mysterious document he signed the night before was truly his final surrender. I feared the heavy synthetic narcotics had finally dissolved his brilliant mind. Marin immediately addressed the glowing screens. She spoke with a practiced, tragic tremble in her voice, formally requesting emergency authorization from the board to sign the massive asset transfer due to her uncle's complete and sudden cognitive collapse. She gestured pitifully toward Roman as her ultimate proof. Arthur Bell did not even wait for the board chairman to reply. He stepped forward and slammed 3 massive, heavily bound physical dossiers onto the polished mahogany table. The sound echoed like a gunshot. He stared directly into the camera array and demanded the immediate public release of the independent emergency room toxicology reports from last Friday, side by side with the original, handwritten medication logs provided by a 22-year veteran of the estate staff. The board members leaned closer to their respective cameras, their expressions shifting from polite concern to deep suspicion. Arthur meticulously outlined how the exact timing of Roman's supposed violent outbursts aligned perfectly with the off-label. Heavy synthetic sedatives Lila Hart had secretly and illegally administered. Marin jumped out of her chair, her voice shrill as she tried to object, claiming the documents were forged by a disgruntled employee. But Elias Brome stepped out from the shadows of the corridor. He silently bypassed the room's main presentation system and cast a raw, unedited video file directly onto the largest central monitor. It was the hidden supply closet footage. The entire room watched, dead silent, as Dean and Lila conspired on the massive screen. The audio was crystal clear, bouncing off the stone walls. Everyone heard Dean explicitly order the doctor to increase the sedatives by 30%. We all heard him command her to keep the billionaire just foggy enough to sign the legal papers, but not foggy enough to die. Lila's pristine face drained of all color. She gripped the edge of the table, looking as though she was about to physically collapse. Arthur did not give them a single second to breathe. He immediately launched the fatal financial strike. He projected the internal accounting cash I had pulled from the printer, tracing the $250,000 consulting fees directly from Roman's living trust into the North Key Stabilization Shell Company. Then, Arthur pulled out a certified banking affidavit. He explicitly connected the exact routing numbers of that fraudulent corporate entity directly to the hidden offshore accounts Dean had used to conceal his vast net worth during our bitter divorce proceedings. Dean panicked. His meticulously crafted composure shattered into a million jagged pieces. He pointed a shaking, desperate finger directly at me. He screamed that I was a bitter, emotionally unstable woman orchestrating a massive, hysterical revenge plot because I could not handle being left behind. He desperately tried to convince the silent board members that I was completely unreliable and dangerously obsessed. I did not raise my voice. I did not shed a single tear. I simply reached into my folder, pulled out the printed internal emails Cora had sent me, and read them aloud. I read Dean's own words, the exact paragraphs where he outlined his premeditated strategy to use my documented divorce trauma to smear my credibility if I ever discovered their medical tampering. I exposed the trap he built for me, weaponizing his own cruelty to completely destroy his unreliable narrator defense right in front of his audience. The room was paralyzed by the sheer, undeniable magnitude of the fraud. And then, the ultimate killing blow was delivered. Roman Ashford lifted his head. The vacant, drooling expression vanished entirely from his face. He sat up perfectly straight in his wheelchair, his eyes burning with the cold, ruthless fire of the legendary corporate titan he truly was. The silence in the room was absolute, so heavy it felt hard to breathe, as he looked directly at his terrified niece. His voice was raspy from the lingering chemicals, but every single word struck like a heavy hammer against a steel anvil. He told the board that the document Marin had forced him to sign the previous night under the heavy influence of narcotics was not a transfer of executive power. He had used a momentary, agonizing window of clarity to forge a different legal directive entirely. He had successfully triggered the ethical trust addendum left behind by his late wife. He declared, looking straight into the camera lenses, that upon the presentation of undeniable elder exploitation, every single ounce of executive voting power was immediately and permanently stripped from any family member involved. Marin let out a strangled, breathless gasp, collapsing backward into her heavy leather chair. She realized her massive empire, and her desperate lifeline out of her crippling private debt, had just turned to ash. The multi-million-dollar logistics network sale was officially frozen. The fraudulent guardianship petition was instantly suspended by the board's legal counsel. Arthur Bell calmly informed the room that the state inspector general and the local financial authorities had already received the identical physical dossiers and were currently en route to the estate with criminal arrest warrants. Dean tried to back away toward the heavy oak doors, his eyes darting wildly like a cornered, desperate animal, but Elias Brome stood firmly in the threshold, crossing his massive arms, completely blocking the only exit. The man who had spent years manipulating the legal system to destroy my life was now entirely trapped by it. When the chaos finally settled, and the flashing lights of the police cruisers illuminated the long gravel driveway to take control of the estate, I did not receive a magical, unrealistic fairy tale ending. I was not suddenly handed $1 billion, but Roman and Arthur called me into the restored, quiet sanctuary of the West Wing study. Roman looked at me with profound, unspoken respect. He formally offered me the position of managing director for his family's massive community recovery trust. Alongside the lucrative, stable position, Arthur handed me a heavy legal retainer agreement and a substantial compensation check for my unauthorized, highly hazardous auditing work. It was exactly enough liquid capital to completely reopen my finalized divorce settlement. I now had the money, the unassailable proof of his hidden assets, and the absolute best legal team in the entire state ready to tear Dean Kessler to pieces in family court and take back every single dime he had stolen from me. I packed my small suitcase one final time. I walked out of Storm Point House just as the heavy storm clouds finally broke, letting brilliant, blinding sunlight wash over the rugged Maine coastline. I was no longer a broken, pitied victim standing in the ashes of my old life. I had walked straight into a sophisticated, highly funded machine designed to crush my dignity, and I had not just survived it. I had shattered it into pieces right in front of the man who genuinely believed I would forever just quietly endure the pain. Thank you all for listening to this story. Please let me know where you are listening from in the comments so we can connect and share our thoughts. And do not forget to subscribe to the Violet Revenge Stories channel. Like the video, and hit the hype button so this story can be heard by even more people.